I am 83 years old. My hands shake now when I lift the kettle. My knees remind me every morning that I have asked too much of them for too many decades. I wake before the sun because that is what my body learned to do in the years when the cows did not care whether you had slept. I sit in my kitchen in the dark, and I drink my coffee, and I look at the chair across from me, the chair where she used to sit. And I think about the morning she told me the thing I have never spoken aloud to another living person. Not to my husband before he passed, not to my bishop, not to my remaining children who still live inside the community and who do not know that their sister said what she said to me, and that I said what I said back, and that what happened in that kitchen on that gray October morning is the reason I have not slept a full night in 11 years. She was 29 years old. She had already made her decision. She did not come to ask my permission. She came to say goodbye. And before she walked out my door for the last time, she turned around and she told me something I was not prepared to hear. Something that broke open a part of me I had spent 29 years keeping carefully closed. I have carried it since then like a stone in my chest. I am 83 years old, and I do not know how many mornings I have left. And I think it is time to put the stone down. Before we go any further, there's something I want to say from the heart. More than 90% of the people watching right now haven't subscribed yet. And perhaps that wouldn't matter so much if these stories were just words. But they're not. They're pieces of stories, pieces of people, pieces of moments that changed us forever. So if you found comfort, meaning, or even a little bit of yourself in these videos, please take a moment to subscribe. It's completely free and helps this community continue growing. And while you're here, I want to know, what feeling brought you to this video tonight? Let me know in the comments below. Her name was Ruth. She is still Ruth to me, even though she goes by something else now, something English, something I cannot bring myself to say because it feels like admitting she is gone entirely, and I am not ready for that, even now. Ruth was my third child and my most difficult one. Not in the way people mean when they say difficult, not stubborn or disrespectful or wild. She was difficult the way a window is difficult when it lets in too much light. She saw everything. She always saw everything. When she was 4 years old, she told me that the neighbor's horse was sad. And I said, horses do not get sad. And she looked at me with those dark, serious eyes and said, "This one does, Mama." And 3 days later, the horse died. I do not know what to make of that still, but that was Ruth. She noticed things that the rest of us had learned not to notice. She asked questions that had no good answers inside the community. She asked them quietly, not in church, not in front of the elders, but at night in the kitchen when it was just the two of us and the lamp was burning low, and she would look up from her mending and say, "Mama, do you think God made the rules, or do you think the men made the rules and called them God?" And I would tell her to hush. I would tell her that kind of thinking leads nowhere good. I would tell her that faith is not a question, it is an answer. And she would nod and go back to her mending, and I knew even then that I had not convinced her. I had only taught her to be quiet about it. That is what I did for years. I taught her to be quiet. I have thought about that a great deal in 11 years. What might have been different if I had let her speak? But I was raised the way I raised her, and I did not know any other way. When Ruth was 16, something happened that I did not understand until much later. There was a boy. There is always a boy in these stories, I know, but this one is not what you think. His name was Daniel, and he was from a neighboring district, and he and Ruth had spoken at a singing twice, 3 times, maybe 4, nothing more than that. And then one afternoon, I found Ruth in the barn, sitting in the hay with her knees pulled to her chest and her face turned away from me, and I asked her what was wrong, and she said, "Nothing." And I said, "Ruth," and she said, "Daniel is going to marry someone else." And I said, "That is how these things go sometimes." And she said, "I know, Mama, but I wanted him to choose me, and no one has ever chosen me for myself." And I did not know then what she meant. I think I know now. She was not crying over a boy. She was crying over a life. She was 16 years old, and she already understood that in our world, a girl is chosen or she is not chosen. And the choosing has very little to do with who she is, and almost everything to do with what she can offer. She had seen enough marriages by then to understand what waited for her. She had watched enough women. She had watched me. And here is the thing I have not said to anyone. She was right to be afraid. I know that now. I did not know it then, or I would not let myself know it then, which is a different thing entirely. There is more I need to tell you about that year, about what happened when Ruth turned 17 and my husband began talking to a family 2 districts over, about the conversation the men had without Ruth in the room, about what Ruth did not say and what I did not say, and what we both pretended was not happening. There is something I did the week before her wedding that I have never told anyone, not even my husband. I am going to tell you now. The week before Ruth's wedding, I went into her room at night after the house was asleep. She was 19 by then. The arrangements had taken 2 years to settle. 2 years of Ruth going quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet. This was not the quiet of a woman keeping her thoughts to herself. This was the quiet of a woman who had stopped believing that her thoughts mattered. She lay in her bed and she was not asleep, and we both knew she was not asleep. And I sat down on the edge of her mattress the way I had when she was small and sick, and I did not say anything for a long time. The house smelled of the bread I had made that morning. Outside, the autumn was pulling the last color from the trees. I reached out and I touched her hand. She did not pull away. She did not speak. And then I said the thing I had come to say. I said, "Ruth, if you do not want this, tell me now." She turned her head and looked at me in the dark, and I could not see her face clearly, but I could feel the change in the room, the way the air shifted. And she said, "Mama, would it matter?" And I did not answer her. I did not answer her. I sat there on the edge of her bed with my hand on hers, and I said nothing. And after a long moment, I smoothed her quilt, and I stood up, and I left the room. I have replayed that moment more times than I can count. I have asked myself what I was afraid of. I have asked myself what I thought would happen if I had said, "Yes, Ruth, it matters. Yes, Ruth, I am listening." I know what I was afraid of. I was afraid of what came next if I let her speak. I was afraid of my husband's face. I was afraid of the bishop. I was afraid of being the woman whose daughter had refused a good match. I was afraid of the community deciding what kind of mother I was. I put all of that fear above my daughter's question, and I left the room, and 3 days later she stood in her blue dress and made her vows in front of 300 people, and her voice was steady, and I told myself that meant she was at peace. I told myself that because I needed to. Before we go any further, I want to be completely honest with you. Over 90% of the people who watch these videos still haven't subscribed. And every time I see that, I wonder how many silent hearts are listening without realizing they've already become part of this journey. If these stories, these reflections, have ever made you feel understood, then I hope you'll subscribe and stay a little longer. It's free, and it helps keep these words alive. And before we continue, tell me something in the comments. What is the one memory you find yourself returning to over and over again? Ruth's marriage was not a cruel one. I want to say that plainly. Her husband Aaron was not an unkind man. He did not raise his hand. He did not speak harshly. He provided. He was steady in the way a stone wall is steady, solid and unmovable, and a little cold in every season. Ruth built her life around that wall. She kept her house. She raised her children. She made her bread on Fridays and her butter on Tuesdays, and she came to church and she sat in her place, and she did all the things that were required of her. And I watched her do them for 10 years, and I told myself she was fine. I told myself she had found her peace. And then one spring, her youngest started school, and Ruth started reading. I do not know how she got the books. I did not ask. I found one on her kitchen table once when I came to visit, and it was a book about women's history, and she was not embarrassed that I had found it. She just looked at me and said, "Mama, did you know there are women who chose their own lives?" And I said, "Yes, Ruth, but we do not live like that." And she said, "I know." She said it the way you say, "I know," to something that is hurting you. That year, she started asking different questions again. The quiet had lifted. She was 29 years old, and she was asking questions the way she had at 16, but they were heavier now because she had a decade of answers she had not wanted. She asked me once that year, "Do you love Dad, Mama?" And I said, "He is my husband." And she said, "I know, but do you love him?" And I could not answer her. I changed the subject. I asked if she wanted more coffee. She said yes, and we sat together for another hour and talked about nothing. And I drove home that evening, and I sat in my buggy in my own yard for a long time before I went inside. Something was shifting. I could feel it. I told myself it was Ruth going through a hard season. I told myself every woman has her hard seasons and comes through them. I told myself prayer was the answer. And then came October. She asked me to come alone, no other family. She called from the phone shanty at the edge of the property, and she said, "Mama, I need to talk to you, and I need it to be only you." And I heard something in her voice I had not heard since she was a girl in the barn with her knees to her chest. I went the next morning. Aaron had taken the children somewhere. The house was empty and very quiet. Ruth made coffee, and we sat at her kitchen table, and she folded her hands the way she does when she is gathering herself, and she told me she was leaving. She said it plainly. She said, "Mama, I am leaving the community. I am taking the children and I am going. I have already found a place. I have already spoken to someone who helps women like me. I have a plan." She said all of it quickly, the way you say a hard thing when you have practiced it many times. And I sat there, and I felt the ground shift under me the way it does in those first seconds of very bad news. I thought about the shunning. I thought about Aaron. I thought about the bishop. I thought about my grandchildren growing up English. I thought about all of those things, and then I looked at my daughter's face, and I saw something I had not seen in years. She was not afraid. For the first time in perhaps a decade, she was not afraid. And something in me that had been held very tightly for a very long time came loose at the sight of that. I started to cry. She had not expected that. She reached across the table and took my hand and said, "Mama, please do not." And I said, "I am not crying because you are leaving. I am crying because I should have let you stay when you were 19. I am crying because I left your room." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and she said, "Mama, I need to tell you something." She said, "I know you came to my room that night. I know you asked me, and I know you left." She said, "I am not telling you this to hurt you. I am telling you because I spent 10 years being angry at you for leaving. And then I spent 1 year understanding why you did. And I need you to know that I understand." She said, "You were as trapped as I was, Mama. You were just trapped for longer. And you believed in the walls. I did not." I sat there in her kitchen in the October light, and I received those words from my daughter, and I did not argue with them because they were true. Every word was true. She was the most honest person I have ever known. She got it from somewhere. I do not let myself think too hard about where. She left 2 weeks later. The shunning came. Her brothers did not speak to her. My husband went silent in the way he always went silent when things were too hard for words. I was not supposed to have contact. I followed the rules for 3 months. And then one gray morning, I sat in my kitchen in the dark, the way I do now, and I thought about a 16-year-old girl in a barn with her knees to her chest. And I thought about a bedroom I had left without answering a question. And I picked up the telephone my youngest English neighbor had helped me get, and I called my daughter. She answered on the second ring. She said, "Mama." I said, "Ruth," and that was enough. We have spoken every week for 11 years. My husband never knew. My bishop never knew. My other children still do not know. What I did with that telephone was the first truly free choice I made in 83 years of living, and I would make it again without hesitation. There are things the community calls sin that are not sin. There are things the community calls obedience that are not virtue. I know the difference now. My daughter taught me. I am 83 years old. I wake before the sun, and I sit in my kitchen, and I look at the empty chair, and I drink my coffee. Most mornings, I pick up the telephone, and I call Ruth before the rest of the world is awake. She lives far from me now. She has built a life I do not fully understand, but I can hear in her voice that it is hers. She chose it. She is not afraid. I think about the question I did not answer the night before her wedding. I think about the silence I gave her when she deserved words. I cannot go back to that bedroom. I cannot be the mother who stayed. But I can be the mother who calls. And I am. Every morning before the sun. To anyone listening who has ever been the daughter in that room, whose question was met with silence, who learned that your wanting did not count as much as the community's comfort, I want to say this plainly. Your wanting counted. It always counted. The people who could not hear it were not bad people, always. Sometimes they were just afraid people. Afraid the way I was afraid. But fear is not an excuse. It is only an explanation. And knowing the difference, that took me 72 years to learn. I am telling you now, so perhaps it does not take you as long. The voice that said, "I do not want this," that voice was not weakness. That voice was the only honest thing in the room. Listen to it. It has been waiting a long time. Before you leave, I want to thank you for staying with me until the very end. I know there are millions of videos you could have watched today, yet you spent these moments here. But there's one thing I noticed. More than 90% of the people who watch these videos still haven't subscribed. So if this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you of someone, somewhere, or some feeling you thought you had forgotten, I hope you'll subscribe. It's free, and it helps these stories continue. And before you go, tell me, what part of this story stayed with you the longest? I'd love to read your thoughts below.